We'll give it a couple of minutes. If he's not here, we can certainly start without him and let him come in on the back end. You want to have JT go ahead and get Ms. Fontenot right there coming? You guys ready? You all right? Ready? All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go ahead and get started with this. It's Friday. Everybody has a lot of stuff to cover before the weekend, but all of you guys know me. I mean, I've been here 50-something years. I've been a lawyer here in town for 40 years, and most of you have followed the trials and tribulations of our firm in dealing with international petrochemical industry tragedies, going back to ones in the 80s with Phillips, more recently, BP Texas City, where we had the lead counsel role in the 2005 explosion, the major roles we had in the BP oil spill, and the roles we've had in many of the other tragedies that seem to befall our petrochemical industry all too often. The purpose of calling this meeting today was several. There have been a lot of things that happened over the last week that leave the community at large and the press in particular without facts that they need. And because we do this so often at so many different levels, we already know a lot of things. I'll tell you a little bit why we know a lot of those things. And I want to let you know more about a lot of the things that will be going on in the future from a litigation standpoint, from an investigative standpoint, and the health issues that many in the community are concerned about, as well as where they stand as a result of the explosion. I'm going to run through all of those. It will take probably 15 to 30 minutes to cover all that groundwork and get you guys up to speed. After that, I've got a couple of people that I want to introduce and have say a few other things, and I'm certainly free to ask and answer questions of you while we're here. And if any of you have more detailed questions or issues that you want to have flushed out more comprehensively after this meeting, I'm happy to stay around and answer those. First, I want to say a few things about who the major players are in this case. I don't know how many of you have followed explosions like this in detail, but what happened as a result of the explosion Wednesday is that a lot of things kick into gear. We have a command center in Beaumont, the emergency center for the Jefferson County and other local authorities that have emergency management planning in the event of a catastrophe of this nature. It's not something that they don't plan for at some level. It remains to be seen as a result of this how good that planning is now that we've seen a major incident in our own backyard for the first time in a long time. So what we'll be doing as we go forward, and we encourage the press to follow, are all the things that the community should be interested in and the press should be interested in, and not only what happened in this occasion, what can be done to avoid it, why it happened this time, and how well the community is prepared for an incident like this again. And, you know, if you want to look, for example, with what happened in with DuPont with BP Bhopal, the chemicals used there got out of containment and killed thousands of people in the community immediately adjacent to the facility. So the fact that this plant has been so disruptive to the community and forced an evacuation, which is a rare occurrence, I think it draws the attention to the fact that this is a very high risk deal. Most of the community and the media and others, community leaders, tend to think that what goes on inside the compound or the gates or the fence of a petrochemical plant stays there, and that the people that work out there take some degree of increased risk associated to their employment, that the community around it is generally safe. And we now know, again, that that's bullshit. That the things that happen in those plants not only put people at excess risk, but also the things that happen in that plant can also put the entire community at risk. And those are the things I hope the media takes with it when we leave here. And I'm going to go through a number of things that draw more attention to how high that risk is, what the health risks are now, and how close we came from this tragedy and what still some would even call a near miss as to something that could have had catastrophic implications to the entire community, which is what precipitated some of the evacuation concerns. So in that vein, let me explain a few things to those that don't know a lot about what happens with these kinds of cases. I travel around the country doing this to the media in these other places that we do this work because the media in that area is very interested. This is the first time it's happened at this level in Southeast Texas here in Jefferson County in a long time. So it's not unfamiliar terrain for my law firm. It's certainly unfamiliar terrain for some of those in the press that don't normally follow this with a lot of detail. So in that vein, the first thing that happens after an explosion like this is a lot of things are triggered. First, we have, as I mentioned, the command centers in Beaumont and Jefferson County, the emergency management teams. The petrochemical plants involved have their own emergency management teams that kick into gear. Messaging begins to take place. There's a playbook, basically a playbook of lines of communication of what the plant needs to do in response in terms of the chains of command that they report to upstream within their own hierarchy of the plant and the corporation back to their home office, and which stages of personnel involved in each of those levels of management need to then kick into gear their own communications. So plant managers locally are in charge of communicating to the local press, to the local community leadership, to the mayors and others, and serve as a point person to the state and federal investigative authorities. Upstream from there, you have other layers of the hierarchy of management responsible for communicating to state level people, the governors, and higher up from that in catastrophic events all the way to the White House and elsewhere. So that's how the hierarchy works. The feds and state involved players become ones that we see by acronym. So I want to refamiliarize yourself with some of them that you've heard of and probably some that you have not. Most typically you hear about OSHA. Everybody knows OSHA because they're well involved in general safety and health as a federal agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And what they generally do is kick the tires on employment places as well as plants. There's no comprehensive or very little comprehensive review of safety measures inside the petrochemical industry by OSHA from a prophylactic standpoint. They tend to come out more often after something's happened and investigate why it happened and look for infractions of OSHA regulations and initiate findings and opinions. So OSHA is out there now doing just that. You also then have TCEQ, Texas Commission, Texas Quality, TC, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They are the merger of Texas Water Commission and others. They basically come out and check on environmental emissions, water, other things that could be impacted from the chemicals that are released from these incidents. And I'll talk a little bit more in a little while about the chemicals that came out, what they are, what the risk factors are, both short-term in terms of what you call acute exposures, as well as long-term in what you call chronic exposures or latent disease processes that can emanate from them. You also have the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Again, that's another federal agency. They're involved in the investigative issues in this case and are participating. You also have one that many of you are probably not particularly familiar with, which is the CSB. The CSB, Chemical Safety Board, is abbreviation for United States Chemical Safety and Health Hazard Investigation Board. They are a very specialized subgroup of government agents and an agency that has a very focused responsibility. They only come in petrochemical incidents. They don't get involved in any other kinds of incidents. And they have people within that organization that specialize in just dealing with what happened in a petrochemical environment to cause an explosion. It's called a root cause analysis. So they go in and dial into not just what happened, but why it happened. And they don't just look at, well, it happened because something got out of containment and hit an ignition source. They go into why did it get out of containment? What was going on with training with the personnel? What was going on with the integrity, the piping, P&ID issues? So they look at all of those issues and they come into a root cause analysis of this has multiple different causes due to a lax culture of safety. It has to do with too much concern about profitability and keeping the plants operating as opposed to routine maintenance. So they will come out with the ultimate findings in this case. They're taking a daily role in investigating this now over at Edson Plaza. They're visiting with people from all sides and people that were working out there and other people from basically a voluntary investigative standpoint. So we will anticipate that the CSB, as really the best federal agency in coming to conclusions about what happened and why it happened. But we anticipate the typical role that we have with them is 6 months to a year down the road, seeing a preliminary report. There will be a town hall meeting where they will explain all that to you guys and the rest of the community, and then ultimately they'll come up with a final report that will be released, that will be their ultimate conclusions, as well as recommendations. And the goal of CSB is to identify why these happen, to communicate those to the industry at large, and hope that the industry takes that information with it and improves and self-regulates itself to reduce the risk down the road. That has historically met with mixed results, which is why we continue to have process safety containment problems that result in explosions around the country. So those are the agencies that are involved from an investigative standpoint right now. We are no doubt will have an independent investigation at some level from TPC, the plant that's involved. They're a relatively small organization. They're not like BP or ExxonMobil. They operate on a much smaller level with just a few operating plants. And interestingly, they're owned by Venture Capital Group. So how they handle this internally remains to be seen, and I'm not personally had experience in dealing with their facility or how they portray their investigative roles. We do know this generally, that whenever these kinds of incidents happen, and we see it all over the country where we work, the immediate and understandable reaction from a target defendant to litigation of this nature in the plant is to go into damage control. Lots of bad things can happen to them as a result of an explosion like this and a release of containment. OSHA can fine them. They can lose certain rights and lax oversight that they have and become much more scrutinized by our federal agencies going forward. Rarely the Department of Justice and others get involved and even threaten other higher level criminal activity. We work very closely with the Department of Justice in Texas City to make sure that there were some criminal prosecutions in that case because of the egregious nature of the conduct that resulted in those fatalities. So all of those are out there. They also understandably look at the damage from civil litigation in addition to the criminal threats and citations. And the civil litigation is primarily what our firm does, as well as some of the other firms in the area and as well nationally. Those result in the claims by individuals associated to a wide scope of different things that happen as a result of an explosion. Usually first you look at, did anybody get hurt bad? What are their rights and remedies? In this case, fortunately, there were not a lot of very serious injuries at the scene. I'll expand a little more shortly about why there were so few injuries. Then you look off-site, were people injured or hurt in some manner off-site? I'm going to introduce to you after a while Ms. Fontenot. They lived out there, and her husband died of a heart attack from the shock he went through waking up with this explosion out there, and it's a tragedy that is a result of this explosion, even though he wasn't killed directly by the blast. So we have to be aware of those things that happen as a result of an explosion of this nature. The other things that you look at are just the reparations, and you look at the damage to property. You look at the impact to the community and the businesses that are put out of business for some period of time and the business interruption that's associated. In this case, we had a near unprecedented number of people that were evacuated. 50,000 people subject to a mandatory evacuation as a result of the fears of the chemicals being released, and also the risk that there would be continued loss of containment in all of the other storage facilities nearby that could threaten the community again at a much greater scope and scale. All things that we will certainly want to know more about going forward as it relates to this plant specifically and to the petrochemical industry in our region generically. You also look at within the windows and stuff, the things that we see from these all the time that we want to make the community aware of is that you have structural damage. There's typically the impact of windows and doors being blown off. We've seen that from what you guys reported on, talking to neighbors. The things they all need to be aware of that you need to communicate to them, though, is that the visible structural damage and the ease of replacement of windows and doors is typically not the major source of the problems. The problems are that these blast velocities are so high that they impact the structure to the buildings themselves. So the collapsing of the doors is the same impact that the walls take. Brick veneers can be shaken loose. The mortar within them can be lose containment and be cracked, and the result of that, down the road, moisture gets in them. The moisture gets in behind the walls, and then 10 years later, you have rotten termites and don't know why that happened. So it causes that kind of structural damage. Sometimes the pressure of these blast waves are so intense that when they hit the house, they compress it and push it into the ground some. It puts pressure on the slabs, and you get cracked slabs from this. It puts pressure on the roof. It blows shingles up, and then they fall back down. They don't look disrupted, but they are. They've lost asphalt seal on them. So you can have that happen. It can crack. It often cracks the rafters inside, not dissimilar to what we see in hurricanes. I think that one of the papers even had pictures of a rafter that was sticking out through one of the roofs that otherwise looked normal. And it's because it pushed that roof in, the rafter popped through the roof, and then the roof came back out, so it looks normal. And but for that fracture that's punctured through, unless they went in the attic, they would have never known. So again, we encourage all the community that has in the range of the blast impact, do a comprehensive investigation of the property, go in the attics and do other things. We recommend structural evaluation before they would consider independent settlement. We know that TPC is going out through these neighborhoods with hired people that they paid, I think about 50 or 60 of them, going door to door, encouraging everybody to sign off on a claim resolution. To the extent TPC or any of their representatives are going out soliciting these neighborhoods on the heels of this disaster with a quick early settlement of their claims, we just encourage them to be patient with the process and not do so. That they at least make sure that they're not signing and waiving away any of their rights they would have as a result of one of these quickie settlements, which is typical of what the industry does, and that they properly go back through their structures to make sure they've been thoroughly evaluated by people that know what they're doing, and a comprehensive review of the property has been made, particularly if they have any exterior damage. It's quite likely that they have some other latent damage that is not visible. And if they settle now and sign a release, they can waive their rights to make those claims later. So there's always a sense of urgency with the companies involved to hurry up, and what they do with damage control is they cut the losses, go out and try to get as many people as you can to get away from the legal system and lawyers. And frankly, even though it's self-serving to some degree, being a lawyer, the bottom line is that when you're settling that early that often, you're usually settling away a lot of your rights that you're not aware that you're settling until later, and it's too late. So those are all things we just encourage the press to help make them aware of. We have no problem with any of them taking whatever monies or other benefits that TPC may offer as a community gesture at this time. Just don't sign anything that would release and waive any of your rights to any of your future claims. We also know that the chemicals involved here have left a layer of soot, so to speak, in a lot of areas that were part of the drift plumes. Those may continue to emanate. Not only did he have smoke drift plumes from the butadiene and other byproducts that were burned off that everybody else saw on TV, there's a lot of product that apparently is still escaping from various vessels and towers out there that is not burned off and isn't burning, so you don't see the smoke. It's clear and you can't see it, and it's generally odorless, so it can go anywhere and settle anywhere and potentially cause damage where it's going without you even knowing. We don't know at this juncture what kind of problems burned off butadiene causes when it settles on cars and stuff. Some of you may remember, if you're anywhere near as old as me, is that when we were kids, before emissions quality was better protected through the EPA, that a lot of times emissions would cause paint on cars to peel and rust. And so the EPA and other agencies have forced the industry to make them quit releasing at those levels. But this kind of a release that's unintended may very well cause some of those kinds of problems. Again, early on in this case, I'm not saying that even does. We just want people to be aware of those things, and if they're signing off on full releases with TPC, they may be at risk of waiving some claims to things that they find out later are problems for them. So we would encourage the press generally just to make sure that the whole community is aware that they are fully appreciative of all these things before they seek early and quick door-to-door knock and resolution with TPC. I want to go into briefly what goes on with the litigation at this juncture. Our firm and 2 or 3 other firms in the area filed for protection from harm to the or damage to any of the equipment and other things that were potentially causes of this incident. It's called a restraining order. TROs, which is a legal acronym for temporary restraining order. We get those early in the case because it forces the defendant to have to honor the court's order to not lose, damage, or destroy any of the potential evidence in the case. This can be infrastructure, this can be notes, memos, charts, reports, internal information that they have that shows what they've been doing at the plant before this happened, what kind of other knowledge they may have had of some of the problems that triggered this event, to better ascertain whether or not the company was aware of the problems that could have caused the event and could have done something about it. So it's very important for lawyers very early in cases to get involved at this level to protect the interests of everyone down the road. Now, being a lawyer, I'm not clueless about what ambulance chasing's about and what other people say about lawyers. And I've seen some of the disparaging remarks made about lawyers in this case already. The bottom line is, in cases like this, it is imperative for the legal community to stand and act and to protect the interests of the community, because otherwise they do not get protected like they should from our government agencies. That's the bottom line, folks. That's the bottom line. And there are many things that government agencies cannot even do that we can do. So as a result of getting the ball started and getting these protective orders in place that preserves all the evidence, makes them honor the terms of the court's orders, and gives us time to do other things. So what are the other things we do? We get our own experts in. I'm not interested in what TPC says they did wrong, because it's in their own interest to say they did as little wrong or nothing wrong or blame other people. Not saying they will in this case, but that's the nature of the industry, is self-protection. I want our own experts to go out there, people that know what goes on in process safety management and the things to look for, and to tell us from a third-party standpoint, not interested in self-preservation, what really happened. We can force that to happen through the litigation process. We can force depositions. We can force a discovery. We can have the court order them to release things that they will not give to anyone else. They don't volunteer all this information to government agencies. They just say, give us your stuff. They don't have the enforcement capacity under most circumstances. We have the right to go and depose, take depositions of anyone out there that we think knows anything. We have the right to go upstairs in the food chain to talk to management people that were making decisions out there that were associated with profitability and budgets and what they knew and didn't know, what they did and didn't choose to fix as part of maintaining their infrastructure out of budgetary considerations or profitability considerations. So it's imperative that all that happens. In this case, what you will see also are what are called class actions, and it's important for the press and the community to understand the difference between a class action and a consolidation and the individual claims. In the civil arena, those three are important to note. If these are filed as class actions only, it means that a few representative people stand in the shoes of all similarly situated people, and a judge can make a ruling in the case on an approved settlement that everybody in the same shoes is treated very similarly. That is an effective way to resolve some issues in dispute. It's certainly an effective way to handle the discovery in these cases, because you consolidate all the costs and organize all of the activities. But many times it doesn't provide for a full independent evaluation of each person's individual damages. So while we support that process generally, there are risks associated to it, and you have to be careful not to globalize it and try to make everybody, the shoe fit everyone the same way. So we have that going. And we're reticent to enforce it across the board, ask for it across the board, but it serves a number of good benefits to the community and our clients down the road. We also have undertaken the process, as have other firms, in representing everyone individually. If you seek out our resources or others, there are many things that we can do for you, provide you with structural engineers, other people that can look at the property. We will continue to be evaluating and independently quantifying the risk of exposure to the butadiene and the other byproducts that are utilized in those facilities. There are a lot of different chemicals that were used out there. We generally understand that this was a crude butadiene process, that this plant had a number of towers that basically distilled and culled out the butadiene from the crude. And at the end of the day, when it went through all of that, you end up with a pretty much clean butadiene product that can then be utilized in the rubber resources, primarily for making tires. So this butadiene is then sold off to Goodyear, Goodrich, Michelin, and others, mostly for the utilization of tires. To do that, you go through a number of processes. It goes through a number of at least some degree of heat and chemical mixing to continue to separate these products out to the end product. And so utilizing those different chemicals and not knowing fully what all was released yet, it remains to be seen which ones were more or less toxic to the environment and to individuals. that's out there. There's also the discussion of asbestos. I tried my first asbestos cases 35 years ago, and I probably know about as much about asbestos as anybody in town. And it's a horrible thing. Southeast Texas was ground zero for asbestos. The first asbestos lawsuits in the country were filed right across the street from my office in the federal court right across the street back in the late 60s, early 1970s with the Burrell and Tomplate cases. Asbestos is a carcinogen, causes cancer. We believe that asbestos was in place at this plant. There was some old asbestos that we understand to be brick encapsulated and maybe even pipe covering. It was very prevalently used at Nature's Butane, which is now TPC, as well as almost all the other plants in the area. This is a very old plant that had a lot of asbestos in it from the time it was built back then, when it was perfectly acceptable to utilize it without those risks being known. A lot of it's been abated out of the plants. We're understanding that some of it may not have been abated, and when this plant exploded and essentially burned to the ground, there's some concern that some of that was released. We do know that there are monitoring processes for air sampling for butadiene, asbestos, and other chemicals. How accurate those are is always somewhat suspect, where their place is somewhat suspect, and frankly, when you have an explosion of this nature that blows all of that back out of containment and encapsulation and releases it in a heat environment, many times it's carried way above any monitoring systems, hundreds of feet or higher up into the air, where it may settle many miles away. So I don't know if we'll ever know how much asbestos was released from this incident, nor if there's a way of properly monitoring, measuring, and calculating that at this point. However, if that's one of the things that could have happened from this, certainly it's something that needs to be followed up on within the community and to be monitored. I understood that there were chunks of the plant that blew to a lot of our clients' properties and other places. And again, the general advice to all of that, because some of it could be contaminated, some of it could have asbestos on it, is just not to touch it. Let people know, let authorities know, and get it bagged and contained. We also recommend for people that have anything that's on their cars and stuff where they're concerned about it damaging the car down the road, you can wipe it, you can take whatever products that are on it, the soot and debris, and wipe it off and put it in a tissue, put it in a freezer and save it for later analysis if that's something we need to do. So there are things that individuals can do for their own protection even now. You have in smoke damage cases like this sometimes people that are predisposed to subsequent problems, asthmatic problems, and things like that. So for anyone in the community that has those kinds of problems, they need to, I would suggest that they follow up more closely with their respiratory therapists and other doctors as a result of those exposures. Those are all things that we're all concerned about, and frankly, early on in this case, we don't know enough about those issues. So that being the case, the next steps with the litigation are taking our temporary restraining orders and getting them put into a more permanent profile. Our firm, having done this very early and doing it very often, know the steps that we take next. And the steps we took next was to immediately get this to counsel for TPC so we could have a chain of command. As litigation counsel, it's inappropriate for us to go directly to the defendant, in this case TPC, and start talking to their leadership about things that we're doing. So we channel that through their lawyers, and we know who their lawyers are, and we direct our attention to them, and we opened up that dialogue last week, shortly after this incident occurred. It's lawyers with Baker & Botts. They're a very well-known international law firm with, I'm sure, well over 1,000 lawyers at this point. I've dealt with their senior leadership and senior partners there on other occasions in the past, so they're competent counsel for TPC. I'm sure they'll do a good job for them, and we've opened up the dialogue on a number of fronts associated to our own investigations into the case and other things that we want to do. We also are working with them presently as a spokesperson to some degree for some of the other law firms in the area as well to have the temporary restraining orders transferred legally into the next step, since temporary is just that, temporary, into a longer-term injunction. We have worked out a multi-page term sheet over the things that would be captured and protected in our investigation to extend that. The first hearing in this litigation that we're aware of will be next Tuesday, and it'll be on the case that we filed last week, and that will take place in front of Judge Templeton in 172nd District Court here in Jefferson County, and that will be over transferring the TRO into an injunction. And should we be able to reach an agreement with TPC's counsel by then, it will forego the necessity of the judge having to make any additional rulings, at least at that level. And right now, I think we have an agreement in principle on the language, and we'll probably have that signed off on Monday between the parties, and hopefully Tuesday the judge can just sign off on it as a perfunctory joint agreement. There are other TROs that are still floating around out there that don't have a hearing yet, and I suspect that in reaching this agreement, that it will probably be able to moot the necessity of having the hearing on the other ones that are out there at this juncture. The next step for our court system is going to be making a determination of how to consolidate these claims. Sometimes what happens in a case like this, we see where there will be a consolidation within one county of all the claims. I understand that there was one case filed in Harris County last week because TPC has a headquarter there as well. And so for whatever reason, that was a chosen venue. And so now you have a diversity of jurisdictions, which makes consolidation of all the actions a little more complicated. Within the county, the judges can normally just assign all of them to one judge for all the preliminary issues, regardless of where they ended up filing. Once they're in multiple counties, that's problematic, and the state at a higher level of the judiciary could weigh in and order what's called a multi-district litigation number and assign one judge to handle all the preliminary matters. We do not know whether or not that will be entertained at this juncture. Sometimes that's done unilaterally, nor do we know if TPC would so move. So those are all issues that are still out there. Other than that, we'll be filing the claim on behalf of Ms. Fontenot and their family for their losses associated to what's happened in their family. We have over 1,000 individual claims that have been retained for people from a wide range of financial issues, from evacuation to property damage, structural damage, and the like. We also have a working agreement with several dozen other lawyers and law firms in Jefferson County, in other areas of the state, and other national law firms that are all out here working with the community interests, where we've been retained by those law firms to be the joint venture firm to help them, those law firms and their clients, get through this process. And again, as many of you who know me, with this being what we do for a living, most of our business that we handle for people come through other law firms that hire us to help with their clients, because we have that level of additional expertise and connections in this field, and they know and entrust us to be able to handle those matters for them. Not saying there aren't some other firms out there that could do it, but we do it at an A+ level, and there are not many firms out there that specialize at the level to be able to provide that level of consistent service to the community that's involved. Any questions over what I've covered so far? I'm hitting a lot of high points. I'm free to sit with you and talk to you about any of the other ones a little later, but again, I wanted to get you guys educated on a lot of issues as quickly as I could. And I know it's a ton of information for you to absorb. Let me go into other places that we have connections. My firm has the privilege of being a designated counsel to the United Steelworkers. The United Steelworkers is the ultimate consolidation of a number of unions, one of which locally here was called the Oil Chemical Atomic Workers, or OCAW. They are the prevalent and most frequent membership involved in providing workforces to the petrochemical industry throughout the country, throughout Southeast Texas. And as a consequence, I've had the honor of representing the interests of the people that work in these plants because of the risk that they take, the development of asbestos diseases from those exposures, the injuries they sometimes go through, and the fatalities that occur out there as a result of things that happen in these plants. And it's a tough job dealing with people that their family members have lost a loved one. It's a tough deal dealing with people that have cancer and are dying because of what happened on the job. But it's something that I'm honored to do. And have been had the privilege of doing for 40 years. My family comes from working in the industry. A lot of the people I run around with and friends of mine work in that industry even today, and so it is somewhat personal. So I think that that's part of what makes our firm take all these cases the extra step, because it is personal as well as professional. That said, the Huntsman plant and the adjacent and the TPC plant were primarily occupied by members of the 4228 USW Hall. We've had the ability to to get a better understanding through the years of our being designated counsel to the local plants, of knowing what goes on in these plants, what each of them do. That background helps us understand more about what happens when something does happen, what the likely causes were. We also have a lot of other community outreaches through people that are involved in these industries. We have other relationships. My wife's uncle works out at that plant. My secretary of 20 years, my legal assistant of 20 years until last year, was a contract resource out there until last week, and now she's been laid off, or at least I think repurposed to Houston. So there are a lot of ways that we have connections from being involved in the community the last 40 years to find out a lot of things that are going on in these plants historically. And so when something like this happens, we have some ways of finding some things out and speculating on some things that gives us a head start in determining what most likely happened in an incident like this. We've had the ability to talk to some of the Huntsman's counsel and resources. Huntsman is next door. They partner with TPC in the utilization of some of the processes involved in what TPC does out there. I won't elaborate on those in detail today, but we have had some discussions with some of their people to also better understand some of the things from their end. Here's what we know so far, generally. We know this is a very old plant. It's originally, I believe, Nature's Butane, built back in the 40s. Our government, it's been a long time since I researched this, but I think it was basically as a result of World War II, we lost access to some of our Asian resources for natural rubber, and we needed rubber for tires for the military and other activities. We needed to create synthetic rubber. And a lot of the chemical plants that popped up here were focused on the ability to create a synthetic rubber. Butadiene, even today, is still utilized in those processes. But bottom line is that these are, most of these plants in this area are very old. And I'll give you an analogy that we like to use. It's like having an old car. If your plant's old, you can compare it to an old car. And I'm sure all of you at some point in your life had an old car. They don't run as well as a new car. They don't have the technology that a new car had. My first car didn't have a seatbelt in it. It wasn't required by law. So there are a lot of technological improvements and safety improvements over new anything, over old anything. Many of these plants are grandfathered in, so they're not required to put in new state-of-the-art technology. And so those become issues in cases. The other thing is, when they're that old and they've run chemicals through them that long, they're rusted out. We live along the Gulf Coast. You have a lot of corrosion on the outside of all these plants. They're all made out of metal. Most of the products that are metal out there rust over time. They do try to use stainless in a lot of places to retard some of that corrosion, but all those are factors. You also have a lot of corrosion from within the infrastructure. So when you look at PNID and you follow the lines of pipe and vessels and towers in these plants, it's exhaustive. Thousands of miles of all of these pipes and stuff run through these plants, and all of them are subject to corrosion from the inside and outside. It's called thin pipe. And it's the responsibility of the plants to try to ascertain where that is and fix that and cure it. The processes of doing that are expensive. They have to shut down units, pull all of that out, and replace it. The expense of doing that has become a concern within the industry. It becomes more and more expensive to do these things, and more problematic is that when they shut down a plant to replace all the worn out parts, they're not making any product, so they're losing money on both ends. So an analysis, an analogy to this, in many respects that you guys can better understand, it would be like if you're in the taxi cab business and you got a bunch of old taxis and you got them out running around all the time, and you own the taxis and you got drivers out there, and the taxis start getting old. And you don't want to spend the money to buy a whole new fleet of taxis because these are still running and they're paid off, so you don't want to create all that new capital expense by spending all that money on new stuff. So you keep your old cabs running. Well, if you keep your old stuff running, you got to change the brakes, you got to change the tires. Every now and then you got to take the motor apart and you got to rebuild it with the rings and pistons and gaskets. Sometimes the motor's just so shot you got to replace the motor, but it becomes a replacement parts process instead of getting a new one. And that's what goes on in the plants. So when these plants run all the time, 24/7 around the clock, they wear out, and it's the responsibility of the management of those plants to routinely keep all those parts in good condition. Unfortunately, it's expensive to do that, and when you do shut it down, you're losing all that money that you're making otherwise. So there's pressure on management not to shut the units down, to keep them running, to go into what they call run to failure, which means basically run your unit until it quits working, and then you're forced to shut it down. And then you have the plausible excuse to tell management upstairs why you shut it down, which is it quit running. Just like the cab driver is making money for the company and he can't take it in for the brake job, so he keeps running until the brakes run out and he hits a tree. And they say, why ain't your cab running today? He said, well, boss, I hit a tree because the brakes went out. He said, all right, well, go ahead and bring it in, haul it in, we'll get you another one. So it's not dissimilar in how that works by that analogy. And in this case, and in every chemical case, you have to look at all the things that can happen. When you're just running all that stuff through there, there's all these things that can go wrong. And the key ingredients in running any of these chemical plants when you're dealing with anything hydrocarbon-based or chemical-based that's volatile is to keep it contained. And if you don't keep it contained and it gets released, if it becomes engaged with oxygen, it becomes combustible. So these liquids usually don't burn. If you stick a match in a can of gasoline in that liquid, you think it'd blow up? It won't. Stick a match in a can of gasoline, it'll go out. Stick a match above the gasoline where the vapors are coming off, it'll blow you up because it's the oxygen in there that's required for the ignition. Now the match is that third ingredient of what they call the triangle, and that matches your ignition heat. And in these plants, there's 1,000 places that heat can come from. Basically, in most of these plants, you're boiling or heating some product to separate out things to create a new product. And you filter those things out by heat and other ingredient process and segregate all those ingredients out. And what happens in these cases when you have liquids and products running through lines and you have a source where it comes out from a leak, a rupture, or something else, it then vaporizes and you get what you call a vapor cloud that's highly combustible that starts seeking a heat source. And if you're lucky, the wind blows it away and it never hits a heat source. You turn off all the heat sources. In Texas City, as an example, when BP blew up, there was a truck running out there and everything, it ran to the combustion of the truck, over accelerated the engine blew up, that was the heat, and that ignition source blew up, that whole area. In most of these cases, you have heat exchangers and other things that are the heat source. We do not know today, I do not know what the heat source was that triggered this. But again, there are multiple places in a plant like that where you have heat exchangers and other things running that can spark your ignition. So we do know, and it was finally related last night. I knew this the day it happened. Common sense tells you that, but we do also from talking to people, and Enterprise talked about it today, which is that a vapor cloud ignited the disaster. And that's our headline today. I knew this was coming, which is why we wanted to get ahead of it and explain a lot more about what this means now that this is now the headline. And so that's why we had this rush to set this up for you this morning. This is what was triggering it, was that we knew yesterday the investigators were at least going to leak something to the press, which is that a vapor cloud caused the explosion. Now this is non-news to the unsophisticated because a vapor cloud explosion, a vapor cloud of gases is almost always what explodes for the reasons I just talked about. So now that we know, and there are admissions here, that the vapor cloud caused it, how did the vapor cloud get out there? Well, the vapor cloud came out there because product escaped from the processes. So then we want to know, and it hasn't been discussed publicly yet, where that product came from and what part of the units and why. At the end of the day, we all want to know, why did this vapor cloud come out there and hit a combustion source, wherever it was from, and cause this explosion? And most importantly, was this preventable? I can tell you today, without knowing for sure a lot of things, but knowing a lot about every other case that's ever occurred out there, this was preventable. I can promise you that today, this was preventable. Every time one of these plants blows up, every time there's a leak in the system, every time one of these things hits the ignition source, every single time it was preventable. If you ran a nuclear facility like you ran these refineries and you had a nuclear accident, it would be catastrophic. And that's why we have a Nuclear Regulatory Commission that walks through every plant with a fine-tooth comb to make sure there's never a leak in containment, because our community cannot take that risk. Unfortunately, we do not have a parallel agency responsible exclusively to the oversight of the petrochemical industry to scrutinize their operations activities and maintenance infrastructure to the same level. And as a consequence, many of them get to run pretty much however they feel like running, because there's very little oversight over the integrity of the asset. So the key ingredient in all of you for the media is going to be the discussion of what really matters in this case, which is what's called process safety management. and the infrastructure of the assets. And we do know in this case, with it being an old plant, and sometimes it could even happen with a newer plant, but when you're dealing with these things and the products that run through them, there's all sorts of ways product can escape. There's all sorts of ways that you make sure it doesn't. Routine maintenance, routine turnarounds, routine shutdowns that shut these plants down and go through a rigorous inspection, x-ray inspection of all the pipe, all the things that you can do. In most circumstances these days, it's not done because the plants do not want to shut down and lose all that profitability. It's called running to failure. There are actually books out there that are titled Running to Failure that are written by people like Mr. Sawyer back here that talk about what happens when you run plants into the ground. And it's no different than if you had that old car and you ran it into the ground. You didn't take the regular oil changes, you didn't take the brake inspection, you didn't do the other things you need to do. The end consequence of it is something bad happens. And with a car, most of the time something bad happens, it finally just breaks down, you're stuck on the side of the road. Something really bad happens and you get the blowout, you might hit a tree, or worse yet, you might hit a school bus and hurt some other people. But in the plants, when you run them into the ground, you run a risk of having the plant burn to the ground, which is what happened here, and you lose your asset. You put people at risk and hurt and kill them, and you force the evacuation of everybody within 50 miles. And in a worst case scenario, you kill everybody within 50 miles. So those are all the risks that are out there. And I want to show you something that I got from just one case that brings that home. I'm not just telling you that's what they do. They put a cost risk analysis to that. How much is it going to cost to fix this problem that we know is out there versus how much is it going to cost if we don't fix it and something bad happens? And that's what they call, in generic terms, risk assessment, cost benefit analysis. And Sean, if you hit, here's 2 pages of a document that some of you may remember from, I think this is BP Texas City. These are internal documents from BP where they basically said, if we go back to the first one, they had trailers out at the plant. And with the trailers out at the plant, and they put them right next to the units, 15 people were killed working in a trailer that day. 10 years ago, 14 years ago, I guess now. We represented people that were out there, represented the little girl who lost both of her parents in that trailer, the Rose. And what they did in that case was say, how much cheaper is it going to be to put temporary flimsy little trailers right by the unit and have people work there versus bringing in blast-resistant buildings or putting them off-site? Well, it's cheaper to have them work right there by the unit because we don't have to shift them. We don't lose time for them working in and out of the plant and getting back and forth. It's cheaper to have a little trailer house out there than it is one of these more expensive blast-resistant buildings. They knew that if you put those out there, and they knew that if there was a BCE or vapor cloud explosion, that it would likely kill those people. So they did a bean counting. How much is it going to cost to run the more expensive equipment out here and have a blast-resistant equipment versus how much is it going to cost if we kill these people? How many people are likely to be killed if it blows up? And they do the math on it. And they have their bean counters come in there and their actuaries and make a determination which way is cheaper. Well, it's a lot cheaper to run the trailer houses out there. You save a lot of money. But what happens if we kill? How much do we have to pay? How much is it going to cost? And what's that risk? And if it's cheaper in their risk model to use the trailers and kill people, that's what they do. And it's the bottom line. It's got nothing to do with not liking people or liking people, not caring about your employees or caring about. Their bottom line is which one's cheaper. And so in that case, they used trailers that they knew they should not use, that they knew the industry did not recommend, that their own studies that they had done said do not use. They still circumvented all of that and used them because they had done a chart and they even compared the houses the same way we analyze it, which is using the 3 little pigs. And the 3 little pigs, y'all remember the story of the house of straw sticks and bricks? Well, the trailer houses are the houses of straw. The blast-resistant buildings are the best ones. So they did a math deal that says these are the cheapest, these are the most expensive. This is their vulnerability. These are the most expensive by expectation of loss. If you got straw, it costs a lot more because your expectation of loss means you're going to kill them. This one, blast-resistant, is almost no expectation of loss because people are saved. This one costs this house is dirt cheap. This is very expensive. So they do the calculation to show you which kinds are the most expensive, least expensive. The bottom result when they do that analysis is the next slide. This is their slide that we found in our litigation. So this is one of many things that we get to do, is find all their dirty documents. They then determined that it was cheaper for them to use the houses of straw, or the trailer houses, because they saved enough money there and it was worth running the risk. They basically use this analogy. All right, under the frequency, the big bad wolf blows with a frequency of once per piggy lifetime. And then the consequence of that, if the wolf blows down the house, the piggies gobble. These piggies, these are people. This is what BP, biggest petrochemical company in the world, is using as a PowerPoint to explain to their own management how they're to look at risk in their plants. Now, I'm not saying today we know TPC was doing that in this case, but I'm saying generically, this is something that all these plants take into consideration, or at least the vast majority of them. Some people might take issue, but the vast majority of them that we've been involved in, and every time we found one of these plants where one of these tragedies happened, this kind of stuff takes place where they do the bean counting. And in that case, they quantified this, and as it said here, here's their maximum justifiable spend. MJS. This is what the companies, these are the acronyms that the companies use. The petrochemical industry utilizes for different things. So when you see this, this is what the industry, and what BP in this case is saying, how much should we spend to save the piggy's life? What's that ratio? Right here, a piggy considers it's worth $1,000 to save its bacon. Well, we know generally what saving your bacon means, and we know specifically what saving your bacon means here. The problem with that is that these companies, in making these decisions on cost and what they're going to fix and what they're not going to fix, they're not taking a risk of their lives when they're over here calculating this. They're taking a risk of the workers' lives. And they're not even telling the workers that they're doing this. You know how livid people that lost their loved ones were when we were able to give them this? You know how livid the people that worked out at that plant, through the union stuff that worked out at the plant were when they saw this? That it boiled it all down to the things they were all kind of knew about, but to see it in black and white, that the company really looked at them all as piggies, and it was all a matter of how much was it worth to save their bacon? It was how much was it worth for the company to save their bacon. And the company used it as a bottom line factor. And we know the results of it in Texas City was that a lot of people lost their lives. BP lost a whole unit out at that plant, but in the meantime, they were driving record profits. Everybody in management was making bonuses, and they were all happy taking that risk on other people. And it's criminal. And that happens time and time again. That's why I wanted to use this kind of an example, but it happens time and time again in the industry. And that's the stuff that we look for and know is out there in many cases as experts doing this. And it's the kind of things that we look for that the government doesn't look for, TCEQ is not going to look for, OSHA's not going to look for, CSB is not going to look for. But goddamn it, we're going to look for it. And we're going to find it. Some of that kind of stuff will most likely be part of the factor that went into this tragedy. I don't know today for sure, but in every other case we've had something like this, bottom line financial considerations came into play. Something wasn't shut down when it should have been. Something wasn't repaired or replaced when it should have been. Something wasn't being done right that the company knew wasn't being done right and put people at increased risk. And I'm promising you today, we're going to find that, because that's what happens in every one of these explosions, because every one of them is preventable. All right, here's some other things that we do know from the operations of this plant that lend us to believe that this kind of a scenario occurred at some level. We know a vapor cloud explosion occurred. The press is now covering that because there's internal admissions and reports from the investigators that say it. But we know that prior to this event, that the company was having problems with their way they were making the product. Basically, as I described, these towers separate out these products, they mix different ingredients in, and we know that what happens when that occurs is that they're having to utilize other ingredients to separate this out, and they have to buy these. And we do know that in this case, whatever they were using in that process was resulting in a side effect in the chemical process, in this mixing and extraction, where one of the inhibitors that's used to keep the product from consolidating in what they call in the industry popcorning, but to keep it from popcorning. And I'd like Mike, Mr. Sawyer, you could come up here for a minute. I want to introduce you to Mike Sawyer. Mike's one of the foremost experts in process safety management in the world. Knows a lot more than I'll ever know about how these industries operate. But Mike, can you explain to us what we understand generally about the popcorning when you run butadiene and the inhibitors they use?
Well, first of all, there's various processes that you can use with butadiene. And in regard to the particular process or licensing that was used at this plant, I've not investigated that at this point because it's too early. But butadiene is notoriously problematic in that its characteristic is that if the inhibitor is not at the right concentration and the right temperature and pressure, it can actually form a popcorn-like structure. And what this does is it coats lines, it coats valves, particularly relief valves is a major problem within the plant for this popcorn-type structure. There's various ways of compensating for this. Again, as Mr. Coon has explained to y'all this morning, it takes time and money in order to do that. And generally, what you're going to find is that there were leading indicators that there were problems at this plant. And I can say this unequivocally without knowing anything. This was totally preventable. And the leading indicators are going to show that maintenance was deferred more likely than not, and various process safety elements were neglected or at a deficient level in regard to the actual process structure or technology, the licensing that was being used at the time. I'm not at liberty to discuss that at this point, but I can tell you, as Mr. Coon said, in order to ensure that you're controlling the popcorn-like structure of the butadiene throughout the process, it has to have the right inhibitors, has to be at the right pressure and temperature. If you ignore it, you're going to have a situation like we had at the facility, where a product that's supposed to be within the confines of vessels, piping, and tankage is released, and it clearly will find an ignition source.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. When we're talking about the releases, there's a lot of different ways that the product can come out. And don't run off, Mike, because I want to have you elaborate on one of those. Most often it comes out because of one or two different things. You'll have a situation where the pipe gets real thin from the, many times from the inside. It's called thin pipe. It's supposed to be a certain gauge so it can keep the product contained. It's usually under some degree of pressure. And when it gets real thin because of corrosion, internally from caustic agents running through the pipe or externally from rust and corrosion, you will end up getting some holes, pinholes sometimes a whole area that you think's real pipe is really just nothing but paint left. And it'll blow out a whole piece of it. And when that comes out, you've got whatever hydrocarbons in there now out of containment. And until they can shut it down, it just keeps running through the system and dumping on the ground, emitting to air until somebody shuts that line down. And because a lot of times what's going through these pipes is in areas that there's no personnel, something like this may go on for a significant period of time before they even realize that it's going on or where it's going on or how to deal with it. You have people in control rooms that try to watch all this by gauges, and they start looking for major deviations in pressure and outflow and stuff like that. But it's usually not a spontaneous reaction where they know real time what's going on and how to deal with it. A lot of times, as Mike mentioned, you have what you call relief valves. There are processes in the system where if you get overpressure for some reason, you need a safety valve where things open up and run you somewhere else to keep